Reformists and the Xingiang riots. Joining the imperialist drive for counter-revolutionary destruction of the Chinese deformed worker state are reformist, quote, socialists, end quote, such as the International Socialist Organization, ISO, in the U.S. The ISO claims that China has never been a worker state, but has been state capitalist since 1949. This, quote, theory, end quote, which they also apply to the former Soviet Union, is a fig leaf for decades of anti-communist practice on behalf of imperialism. The ISO howled alongside the imperialists against the Soviet intervention into Afghanistan. When Soviet forces pulled out of Afghanistan in 1988-89, in a futile attempt by the Kremlin bureaucracy to appease the imperialists, the ISO gloated, quote, "We welcome the defeat of the Russians in Afghanistan. It will give heart to all of those inside the USSR and in Eastern Europe who want to break the rule of Stalin's heirs," end quote. From Socialist Worker, May 1988. 3 years later, the British Socialist Workers' Party, SWP, the ISO's former parent group, exulted, quote, "Communism has collapsed. It is a fact that should have every socialist rejoicing," end quote. That's from Socialist Worker Britain, 31 August 1991. More recently, in an article titled "The Changing Shape of the Struggle in China," Socialist Worker Online, 9 July, the ISO painted a horrific communal bloodletting in Xinjiang as class-infused protest, grotesquely enthusing that the Urumqi riot confirms that grassroots struggles continues to erupt on an expanding scale. On the other side of the reformist spectrum is the Party of Socialism and Liberation, the PSL. A 24 July 2009 article on its website, Behind the Urumqi Riots in China, while rightly denouncing the imperialists and their media for seizing on the riots in Urumqi, is essentially an apologia for the Chinese bureaucracy. Ever so gingerly, the PSL declares that, quote, "relations between the Han Chinese and the Uyghur people are not perfectly harmonious," end quote, while noting that the CCP's market reforms have led to nationalistic rivalries. The PSL disappears any hint of Han chauvinism on the part of the Chinese bureaucracy. Indeed, it is to the Stalinist bureaucracy that the PSL looks as the key barrier to counter-revolution. Writing in an earlier article, the CCP government, in spite of all its contradictions, remains the most important obstacle to the return of China to its previous state of semi-colonial slavery, end quote. In reality, the continued rule of the CCP undermines the defense of the proletarian state power in China. Contrary to the PSL's claims, the bureaucracy continues to preserve state property, not out of a subjective identification with socialism, but, as Trotsky wrote in The Revolution Betrayed, 1936, in regard to the Soviet Union, quote, "only to the extent that it fears the proletariat," end quote, that is, to protect its privileged position as a parasitic caste atop the workers' state. For International Proletarian Revolution. The CCP regime denounces the World Uyghur Congress as separatist. Actually, Kadir and company do not now openly call to detach Xinjiang from China and establish an independent state, though that is manifestly what they're aiming for. The Uyghur jihadists do call for an independent Islamic East Turkestan. As proletarian internationalists, we do not consider the present state boundaries of China to be sacrosanct. But all of the forces advocating or supporting an independent Xinjiang today are in the camp of capitalist counter-revolution. Moreover, the demand for an independent Xinjiang, even if couched in the most democratic language, would be viewed by everyone in the region as a program to drive out the Han people. One cannot envision a progressive solution to the national conflict in Xinjiang except in the context of a proletarian political revolution throughout China. This would open up historical possibilities that do not now exist. Regional autonomy in some form, even an independent state allied to China. The Chinese Stalinist regime of Hu Jintao declares a, quote, harmonious society, end quote, to be the goal of its policies and practices. It is a fundamental premise of Marxism that a harmonious society can be achieved only through overcoming economic scarcity leading to material abundance. Despite China's rapid economic growth since the 1949 revolution, it is still a relatively poor country by international standards. Per capita gross domestic product is 1/10 that of the United States and 1/7 that of Japan. Ultimately, the survival and advancement of China's revolutionary gains hinge on the fight for socialist revolution in the advanced capitalist countries of Japan, North America, and West Europe. The only road towards an all-round modernization of China as part of an internationally planned economy. A proletarian political revolution producing a China of workers' and peasants' councils would be a beacon for the oppressed working masses of Asia and the entire world. That is the perspective of the International Communist League.